Bernard Lacroix did not address Brigitte Bardot when he began speaking. He stood beneath the largest canvas in the gallery and lifted one hand toward it, his voice carrying easily across the room as he described the work behind him as decorative rather than serious. Several guests turned their bodies toward him, but the photographers near the entrance had already turned their cameras toward Bardot. She stood across the gallery floor with her hands at her sides, watching him speak about the painting that hung directly behind his shoulder. The framed canvas on the wall behind Lacroix was one of Bardot's own, the largest piece in the exhibition, hung at the center of the main wall at eye level, visible from every position in the gallery. Its colors pulled the light from the overhead fixtures along its upper edge. Bardot stood across the room with her hands at her sides, her back straight, her eyes on Lacroix. She did not speak, and she did not move toward him. The two photographers near the entrance had already shifted the direction of their cameras within the first minutes of Lacroix's remarks. They were no longer pointing toward the canvases. They were pointed toward Bardot, toward her position on the far side of the room, her hands at her sides, her face forward. They held their frames on her without adjusting as Lacroix continued, his free hand moving between the walls without once turning in her direction. The guests nearest to Lacroix held their program booklets open at their sides or loosely in front of them. Several had stopped mid-conversation when his voice rose to its carrying register, and they had not resumed. The journalist near the side wall had his notepad out and his pen moving in short, consistent strokes. The room had divided into two visible orientations, those with their bodies angled toward Lacroix and those with their eyes moving toward Bardot, and the space between those two positions had grown still. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. The exhibition had opened that evening under Bardot's name, printed on the gallery's exterior signage, and repeated on the cover of the program booklet placed at the entry table before the doors opened. Inside the booklet, each canvas was listed by title with a short description in both French and English. The canvases had been hung in the order she specified, at the heights she had indicated, with the largest piece centered on the main wall. The gallery had been prepared across several weeks. Not a single program booklet had remained on the entry table by the time the first guests had passed through. Bernard Lacroix had arrived with his press companion approximately 20 minutes after the doors opened. He collected a program from a gallery staff member near the entrance, moved through the first room without stopping, and entered the main gallery space where the largest canvases were displayed. He had been circulating for several minutes, pausing in front of specific works, speaking in a low voice to his companion, occasionally making a brief gesture toward a canvas, before his remarks became audible to guests beyond his immediate proximity. Lacroix's position on the Galeries Nationales advisory board was known to the majority of guests present that evening. His written assessments had shaped acquisition decisions for public collections, and his formal reviews in the Paris press had determined which exhibitions received institutional endorsement and which were passed over. Journalists who covered the Paris art world had quoted him in print for over a decade. The press companion at his side was holding a copy of the program and a small notebook of his own. The gallery program carried Bardot's name on its cover, on the header of each interior page, and beside each canvas title in the listing at the back. Every guest in the room was holding one. They had been placed in a single stack on the entry table, and the stack was gone before the room reached its current occupancy. The name on the program was the same name on the exterior signage, and the same name Lacroix had not yet spoken aloud since entering the room. Bardot had been present in the main gallery when Lacroix arrived. She had not moved toward him as he circulated and had not positioned herself near his path through the room. She had remained in the open space on the far side of the gallery, exchanging brief words with two guests who had approached her, and then standing alone with her hands at her sides as Lacroix's voice began to carry. By the time his remarks were audible to the wider room, she was already facing him across an open stretch of gallery floor, with a direct sightline to the main wall where her largest canvas hung behind him. Lacroix turned toward the main wall and raised one hand in the direction of the canvas behind him. He did not address Bardot. He did not use her name, He spoke toward the guests gathered within earshot, and the word he used more than once in the opening section of his remarks was decorative. He applied it without hesitation and without qualification, as a finding rather than an opinion. The journalist's pen accelerated against the page. Lacroix continued without pausing for response. He moved from the largest canvas to the overall arrangement of the exhibition, and in each case his language returned to the same position. Surface construction, he said, work built for visual effect rather than for formal inquiry. He raised his hand toward a second canvas to his left without stepping toward it or looking at it directly. His press companion turned a page in the small notebook he was holding. The guests standing near Lacroix did not move away from his position. Several turned their heads toward the canvases he was gesturing at, following his hand, looking at the surface of the work, and then brought their eyes back to him. A woman near the front of the group let her program booklet drop to her side, the pages falling closed against her leg. The photographer closest to Lacroix's position along the wall made a small adjustment to his camera angle without stepping from his spot. Bardot did not move during Lacroix's opening remarks. She remained in the position she had held since his voice became audible to the room, hands at her sides, her weight evenly placed, her eyes on him. She did not look at the guests near him. She did not look at the journalist whose pen was still moving. She did not look at the canvases Lacroix was gesturing toward, though they were her own work and they were visible from where she stood. All eyes turned toward her when Lacroix paused between the first and second sections of his remarks. The pause was brief. He was repositioning himself, shifting his weight, and turning his body from the large canvas on the main wall toward the smaller works arranged along the adjacent wall. But in the interval of that movement, guests who had been watching him looked across the gallery floor to where Bardot stood. The two photographers held their frames on her without adjustment. She did not move during the pause and did not change her expression. Lacroix resumed. The second section of his remarks addressed the smaller canvases along the side wall, and the register of his language shifted slightly, less clinical than the first section, more dismissive in its ease. Pleasant, he said, carefully constructed, without risk. Each phrase was produced at the same unhurried pace as the ones before it, and each landed without visible hesitation on his part. The journalist had filled one side of his page and was continuing without slowing. The guests who had been moving through the gallery when Lacroix's remarks became audible had stopped. The ambient motion of the opening, guests drifting between canvases, lifting drinks from passing trays, turning to greet new arrivals, had ceased across the main room. The room held its positions. The gallery staff along the walls had not moved from where they had stationed themselves when Lacroix's voice first carried. Program booklets that had been held open at reading height were lowering in guests' hands, dropping to waist level or to the side. Several guests near the back of the room had turned their full orientation toward Bardot, rather than maintaining a divided attention between her and Lacroix. The gallery staff did not speak and did not move. The journalist had turned to a fresh page in his notepad and continued writing without looking up. Lacroix moved back toward the largest canvas on the main wall. He raised his hand toward it a second time, returning to the point he had made in the opening section of his remarks, this time extending it with specific reference to the use of color and to what he described as a studied avoidance of structural risk. His hand remained raised toward the canvas as he spoke. The canvas hung directly behind him, and Bardot, from her position across the room, was looking at it over his shoulder. The two photographers had both settled into fixed positions. Neither was adjusting equipment. Both cameras were oriented toward Bardot, not toward the canvases on the walls, and not toward Lacroix. Lacroix continued speaking. The guests nearest to him had their faces turned toward the main wall canvas following his gesture, but the eyes of several among them were moving between the canvas and Bardot's position across the open gallery floor. Bardot walked toward the wall. Her pace was even from the first step, and she did not slow or adjust her direction as she crossed the gallery floor. She reached the main wall, placed both hands along the sides of the largest frame, and lifted the canvas from its hook in one continuous movement. She turned with the canvas held in both hands and carried it to the center of the gallery floor. She set it upright on the floor, base against the boards, face turned outward toward the guests, and stepped back from it with both hands returning to her sides. She did not look at Lacroix. She did not speak. The room went quiet. Lacroix's voice stopped. The canvas stood on the gallery floor between his position and the assembled guests, its painted surface facing outward, the wall behind him now holding only the empty hook and the pale rectangular outline left by the frame. Lacroix looked at the canvas on the floor. His raised hand remained partially extended for a moment before it lowered, not fully to his side but to a held position at mid-height, the gesture left incomplete. He did not look at Bardot. He did not look at the guests around him. He looked at the canvas, at its surface and at the floor beneath its base, and did not speak. Two photographers raised their cameras at close to the same moment. Both oriented their lenses toward the canvas standing on the gallery floor and the empty wall behind it, the pale rectangle visible where the frame had hung. Neither moved toward Lacroix's position. The journalist lifted his eyes from his notepad for the first time since Lacroix began speaking. Guests who had been standing within the closest proximity to Lacroix shifted their weight back without turning away from him entirely. The movement was not uniform. It happened at different moments across the group, small adjustments of posture rather than steps, but it was visible across the cluster of people nearest his position. Program booklets held in their hands remained still. The gallery staff along the walls had not moved from their positions. They remained standing at the points where they had stationed themselves earlier in the evening, their hands at their sides, looking at the canvas on the floor and at the empty hook on the wall above where it had hung. None of them approached the canvas. None of them moved toward Bardot or toward Lacroix. The journalist had stopped writing. His pen was in his hand, its tip above the open page of his notepad, but it was not making contact with the paper. He was looking at Lacroix, then at the canvas on the floor, then at the empty wall, then back at Lacroix. The press companion standing behind Lacroix had his small notebook closed in his hand and was looking at the floor. No one moved. Lacroix's hand had lowered further but had not settled fully at his side. It remained at a held intermediate position. The fingers no longer extended toward the wall, the arm not yet returned to a resting position. The empty hook on the wall behind him and the pale outline of the absent frame were visible to every person in the room. The canvas stood on the floor with its painted surface facing outward. 5 seconds passed. Lacroix looked toward the guests nearest him. Several of them looked back at him directly. None of them spoke, and none of them stepped toward him. A woman near the front of the group, the same woman who had lowered her program booklet to her side during his opening remarks, looked down at the booklet in her hand, opened it, and looked back up at the canvas on the floor. 10 seconds passed. The photographer closest to Lacroix's position lowered his camera from his eye to his chest. He did not put it away or lower it further. He held it there, still pointed loosely in the direction of the canvas, and looked at Lacroix over the top of it. The journalist turned to a new page in his notepad. He held his pen above it but did not begin writing. Lacroix's arm returned to his side. 15 seconds passed. When Lacroix spoke again, his voice was lower than it had been during his remarks. The sentence he produced was short and did not connect to the language of the previous sections. It was not addressed to anyone by name and did not resume the structure of his prepared assessment. Several guests standing near him heard it and turned briefly toward him. Several did not visibly react to it at all. The guests who had been standing in the group near Lacroix began to move, not toward the exit and not back toward the walls, but toward the canvas standing on the gallery floor. They crossed the open space and stopped in front of it, looking at it from a distance closer than they had been able to occupy when it was mounted on the wall. The journalist closed the distance between himself and Bardot and stopped within speaking range of her, his notepad open in his hand. The canvas remained on the gallery floor for the rest of the evening. It was not moved back to the wall. The empty hook remained visible above the pale outline of the absent frame. Lacroix did not return to the position he had held during his remarks, and he did not resume speaking to the room at the volume he had used before Bardot stood up. By the time the gallery began to empty at the close of the evening, the guests who had stayed until the end had arranged themselves in a loose grouping around the canvas where it stood on the floor, and the program booklets open in their hands were turned to the page with her name on it.